Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics. But here I am just our instructor along this public speaking journey. And I am here for a brief talk about a couple of different types of speeches and a couple of different speech delivery styles, all right? And so these are some fundamentals to help us understand the difference between what kind of public speaking context we're engaging in. And so we'll try to keep it brief and simplify some of these basics and just key in on the ones that we'll likely be using for the context of our courses, all right? So first of all, we can understand that there are different speech types that we might be giving. And some fundamentals could include a speech to inform and a speech to persuade. And informing and persuading are going to be two key areas that we heavily emphasize in this public speaking course. So each of those will be engaged in far greater detail at a later date. For now, we can understand that to provide a speech that informs an audience is basically an approach at educating them, all right? So our position when giving an informative type speech is to present information, to inform or educate, as the title suggests. Now, on the other hand, a persuasive speech attempts to make an argument. So you are taking a position. You are making a case for X, right? Depending on what the thesis is or how you've arranged the parts of the speech. So a speech to persuade is trying to move the audience, move them in terms of an idea or position, the way they think about something, or perhaps the way they act toward a policy or a position. And that for that reason, because there's a lot more weight, we typically reserve that persuasive speech for later in a class setting, right? Kind of a final project type situation. But in the meantime, there are different styles of public speaking, all right? And so I want to mention three very briefly and help us understand the difference between them and emphasize which one will place the majority of our time on in this course. So the first type of speech would be an impromptu speech, all right? An impromptu, as it sounds, is one in which you are putting little or no preconceived preparation into. It's relatively kind of on the fly, as we might say, and so it is, as the word suggests, impromptuous, right? So you're putting a very low amount of effort in advance. Now, we might be engaging in activities in class, whether it's an online class or an on-ground class. And so if we're engaging in activities that require you to get up and maybe share some information or kind of present some thoughts on something, that's very much of an impromptu nature. If I'm ever giving a lecture and we engage in a kind of discussion time, students throw questions back at me, or we're trying to kind of relate in some live situation or scenario, that is very impromptu. And so oftentimes we refer to those types of activities as impromptu exercises, okay? So they tend to be on the minimal scale. We will practice those in life. You will find yourself in many impromptuous scenarios. You already have. You will continue to. Okay, but the next style that we might think of on the other end of the spectrum would be fully prepared, based off of a speech script. Okay, and so we refer to a speech script as a manuscript or manuscript style delivery. All right. Manuscript style delivery tends to be not only heavily prepared, but fully memorized, okay? So when you think about a manuscript style speech, it's one that has been polished, rehearsed to the point that every meticulous part of it is manufactured in advance for the audience by the speaker. So a manuscript style doesn't have room to divert. It is staying on task and entirely focused on a preconceived message. So you can think about it as that written out speech A lot of times we compare the manuscript style speeches to those kinds that are presented by public figures. A president might give a manuscript style speech. Now, we no longer have presidents that are memorizing their speeches per se. The most common factor is that they are reading it from a teleprompter, but they still are reading it with a sense of authority and a sense of, kind of focus. And also another reason they might be reading it is because those types of speeches, manuscript speeches, are formed often by committee or by professional speech writers, all right? And so that's why sometimes when we talk about communication as a field, that's one of those traditional roles or positions or jobs that someone could go into, right? Speech writing. Now, it's not a very common job, but it is a kind of position that we associate with communication. However, I've saved the middle style of speech for last because it plays the heaviest role in what we do in a majority of public speaking sections. All right. So if we have the impromptu on one end of a spectrum where it's very unprepared, it's very live, it's spontaneous even at times, and then we have the manuscript style on the other end of an invisible public speaking spectrum, and that speech is fully memorized. It is completely written out. All right. So what's in the middle? What is that center? What is that core for us? And that is an extemporaneous style of speaking. That's right. Extemporaneous. This is somewhat of an elongated sounding term, very new for many of you all, but hopefully you will become very familiar with it. It's definitely the kind of material we'll test on in a course like this one, but we're also going to be testing it by our practice of it. All right. So in order for us to practice extemporaneous speaking, let's first define it. And I have a very simple three-word three-word phrasing to help us understand extemporaneous speaking and become heavily acquainted with it. And so, are we ready? We're going to define extemporaneous speaking as prepared. Number one, prepared. So you put an extemporaneous type of speech, when you give or perform an extemporaneous speech, it is prepared, right? You have put materials in advance to get it ready. The second thing that the way we could identify or define extemporaneous speaking is it is rehearsed. You will go through phases of getting ready by practicing it out loud. You will go through those routines. If you have an outline, you will look at an outline. You will build an outline. You will create a topic. If you have a visual aid of sorts, you will work with that visual aid. You will put it together, not at the last minute. You won't throw it together, but you will work with it as you prepare your speech. So it's prepared. It's rehearsed, meaning you go over it in advance. But it's not memorized. Remember, that's a manuscript style speech delivery. It's not going to be fully memorized because that gives us a couple of benefits. I'm going to explain why. It's not going to be memorized because an extemporaneous style allows us to perhaps adopt, if not adapt, our tone, our body language, how we communicate to our audience. Okay, and audiences vary, as you know. In fact. There are variations of audience, whether you're giving a speech in an online setting in a digital place of presence versus in a classroom. Fast forward to future uses, you'll be giving them in a boardroom or some other public engagement. An extemporaneous style allows you the freedom to mix it up. Also, for those speeches that are running long on time, extemporaneous style allows us to kind of cut as we're speaking, figure out the way to close, or perhaps let's take an educator for an example. An extemporaneous speech allows the speaker to maybe cut short a lecture or modify it to speak to that audience, right? Recognize whether the audience is very tuned in or perhaps tuned out, and how do we adapt our message to maximize this communication exchange. And so it is first, an extemporaneous speech is first prepared. Second, it is rehearsed. It is not memorized, but it is instead conversational. And so that's that process that I have just described for us. Conversational, the ability to adapt to your audience. Even if it's not an actual conversation, the manner in which you present it, the manner in which you engage others is conversational, even if it's for that moment a one-way kind of communication. But we know from the communication model that the communication is never entirely one way, because we're always receiving, and communication empowers us to send and receive messages most often simultaneously in that communication exchange. So, extemporaneous speaking, a primary way we will communicate in this public speaking section, and I look forward to your extemporaneous speech efforts in the weeks to come. Thank you for listening.